Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave with Evil Eye Games. Today we're going to continue on with building our menu out. So right now, if we hit play and we go to our settings menu, we can select between the different options panes. But right now, the settings in each one of these don't do anything. So we can adjust the sliders, we can click on buttons, but nothing ends up really happening. So we're going to fix that today. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of that. And first we're going to go into our HUD folder, and I'm going to go ahead and reopen our settings menu widget. And then I'm just going to go ahead and shrink down these menus a little bit, so that way I can take a look at the graphics pane, the sound pane, and our controls pane. And if we take a look at the graphics pane here, we should have all the buttons set up from the previous video. So the button to the left is going to be the previous button, and the button to the right is going to be the next button. And we're going to have to go ahead and add these events to our graph. So for each one of these, we're going to select the button, and at the bottom, we're going to hit the plus next to the on-clicked events. And it will add in an event when that button is clicked. But the problem is right now is we're going to have a lot of buttons, and I want to have a way to organize them. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete this. And up at the event graph here at the left, there's a new graph. I'm going to go ahead and add that new graph. And I'm going to call it the graphics pane. It looks like caps lock is on. So what we can do with this additional graph is effectively it's the same thing as the event graph, except it's kind of a sectioned off version of the event graph. So we can put stuff on the event graph specifically into this area, and it'll work just as if it was in the main event graph. So if we have our graphics pane selected up here, and we go back to our designer, and we hit the plus button for on-clicked, it's going to go ahead and add it into our graphics pane. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to go ahead and add an on-clicked event for each one of these buttons. And that will cover all of the buttons in our graphics options except for the apply. I'll go ahead and add a on-clicked for the apply button as well. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to do something a little bit different with the resolution than we are with the other options here. So in our graph, I'm going to go up to our functions. And one of the weird things I've noticed in the widgets is it doesn't give you the option to put these variables into categories like with other blueprints, but it still allows you to put functions into categories. So we have these right here, which are basically the bindings. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select these and I'm going to put them into a category, and I'm going to call it bindings. And then I'm going to go ahead and add each one of these in so we can organize our bindings together. And by the time we're done with this, we're going to have a whole lot of these bindings. So if we collapse our bindings, I'm going to go ahead and add a new function. And I'm going to call this function prev next resolution setting. And we're going to use this to cycle between the previous resolution and the next resolution. And one thing we're going to have to do is I'm going to go back to our content browser, and in our Enums folder, I'm going to go ahead and right click, go to blueprints, and add a new enumeration. And I'm going to call this prev next Enum. And I'm going to open this up, and we're just going to go ahead and add two enumerations to it. I'm going to add prev, and I'm going to add next. So I'm just going to save this, and we'll close. And I'm going to go back to our settings menu widget and our previous next resolution setting function. Now I'm going to want to add a new input. And I'm just going to call this prev/next. And for the type, we're going to get that prev next enum. And this is going to determine if we're going to the next setting or the previous setting. And the first thing we're going to do from our resolution setting execution here, we're going to drag off, and I'm going to search for supported, and we have the option for get supported full screen resolutions. And this is going to return a value of all the full screen resolutions that whatever system is on will support. Next, we're going to want to go ahead and perform a switch off of our previous next input. And we're going to go ahead and plug that into our get supported full screen resolutions. And we're going to have to create a new variable. So I'll go ahead and hit plus to add a variable. And I'm going to call this the current resolution index. And for the type, I'm going to make it an integer. And I'm going to go ahead and add a second new variable. And I'm going to call this the current resolution. And for type, I'm going to make this a string. Now, the get supported full screen resolutions here returns an array of, actually, it's a specially put together array for resolutions. And within each element of the array, it's going to have an X value and a Y value. Now, we can't promote this to a variable because it's a specialty structure. And we haven't used structures yet, but we will get to that soon. So what we're going to want to do is, in order to get the length of our supported full screen resolutions, I'm going to drag out from the resolutions, and I'm going to search for last indexed. And this is going to return the last index number in the array. So that way we know how long the array is. And now let's take a look at what we're going to do on when we go to a previous setting and when we go to a next setting. So what we're going to do is we're going to get our current resolution. We're going to go ahead and we're going to subtract 1 when we go to the previous. So I'll select an integer minus an integer and make sure it's subtracting 1. And then to go ahead and make sure this doesn't go over the limit, I'm going to drag out and I'm going to search for a clamp. And the minimum value is going to be 0. And the maximum value, I'm going to go ahead and plug the number of our last index into the max. So this clamp is going to make sure that the number returned after here will fit within this range. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to set our current resolution index. So we'll connect our previous up to that set. And then we want to go ahead and get the values for the resolution and populate our string for the current resolution. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag from our resolutions. And we're going to go ahead and get. And we'll plug the return value from our clamp into that get. And then we want to go ahead and break the result. And that'll return the X and the Y values of the screen resolution for that index number. Now we want to go ahead and set a current resolution. So I'm going to drag this current resolution out here and set it. And in order to do this, I'm going to drag out from our current resolution and I'm going to search for append. And we can use this to make our resolution string. Now we're going to need to add a pin. So there's 3 values here, an A, a B, and a C. And I'm going to simply plug the X into the A and the Y into the C. And then in the B here, I'm just going to simply type in a lowercase x. And then for going to our next value, all we're going to simply need to do is take our current resolution index. We're going to go ahead and add 1. And then we're going to go ahead and clamp again. And we're going to clamp with the minimum value being 0 and once again the maximum value being the last index. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to copy these up here. So the set current resolution and the set current resolution index, and we'll plug our next into the set current resolution index. And we're going to set that value to the return value of our clamp. And then we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy all of this up here. So we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get the return on our clamp of the integer. We're going to break it, and we're going to put the x value into the a, the y value into the c, and the b will just be the lowercase letter x. And we'll plug that into our set current resolution. And that's going to be it. So I'm just going to go ahead and organize this up a little bit. All right, so essentially we're coming in and we're going to go ahead and based on our previous next, we're going to make a switch and we're going to get our supported full screen resolutions, and that will return an array of the x and the y value of those screen resolutions. And then we're going to go ahead and perform a switch. So depending on whether we select previous or next, if we select previous, it's going to get our current resolution index. It's going to subtract 1 from that index, and it's going to clamp it to make sure it doesn't go below 0. And then we're going to set our current resolution index to that value. And then we're going to perform a get on our full screen resolutions. We're going to break it apart into the x and the y component, and we're going to append a string, and we're going to put a lowercase x in between those values, and then we're going to go ahead and set our current resolution string. Then for our next, we're simply going to, instead of subtracting 1, add 1. We'll clamp that value, and we'll make sure it doesn't go over the value of the last index. We will set the current resolution index to that value, and then we're going to go ahead and get that index, break it apart into the x and the y, and then append it to a string with an x in between the x value and the y value. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and compile and save, and I'll close this function out. And back in our graphics pane, if we go to the top, we're going to find our resolution previous button and our resolution next button, and we're going to drag off, and we're going to search for that function we just created. So we'll select the prev next resolution setting, and we'll plug one of each into the next button and the previous button. And then for the previous button, we want the prev next set to prev. And for the next button, we want it set to next. And I'm going to go ahead and put a comment box around this. And I'm just going to say it's the resolution buttons. And then in our designer, we're going to go ahead and we're going to find the text for our resolution. And then I'm going to go ahead and bind this and create a binding. And I'm going to rename this function because I don't like that naming convention. And then we're simply going to grab the current resolution text and get it, and we'll plug it into our return node. And that is going to be it. So we can go ahead and compile and save. And if we hit play and go to our settings, it's going to start out blank, because the default value for our string is empty. But if we hit the next button, it should increment our resolution up. And if we hit the previous button, it should scale the resolution down for us. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of that. And we can close out of this. I'm going to go ahead and put that binding into our bindings category. And we'll compile and save that. And now we're going to have to create an action that'll do a previous and a next function for our other graphic settings. So in order to take care of this, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to go back to our main menu. And in our content browser here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new blueprint enumeration. And I'm going to call this the high, medium, low enum. And we're going to go ahead and open that up. And I'm going to add 3 new enumerators. And I'm going to simply make them high, medium, and low. And we'll hit save and close. And I'm going to go ahead and create a second enumeration. So I'm going to name this one Graphics Settings Enum. And I'm going to go ahead and open this one up. And I'm going to add an enumeration for each type of graphic setting that we have other than the resolution. So in this case, I'm using 5. So I'm going to add 5 new enumerators in here. And I'm just going to simply list what they are. We have the anti-aliasing. There's the post-processing. There's the shadow quality. There's the texture quality. And finally, there's the effects quality. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and close it out. And we're going to go into our settings menu widget. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new function. And I'm going to call this the previous next HML for high, medium, low settings. So I'm going to select our function here, and I'm going to create a new input. And I'm going to, like the last one, call this prev/next. And the type will be our prev/next enumeration. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a new input. And I'm going to call this the setting. And we're going to use this to apply a specific setting. And I'm going to search for the high, med, low enum. And then finally, we're going to add one last input. And we're going to call this the setting type. And then we're going to go ahead and search for the graphics setting enum. So from our prev next HML setting input here, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to promote this setting to a variable. And I'm going to make it a local variable. And I'm just going to call it the high, med, low temp. And then I'm going to go ahead and go into a sequence. And then from here, I'm going to grab the prev next input, and we're going to search for a switch. And we're going to plug this into the then 0 pin. And I'm going to go ahead and get our high, med, low temp. And we're going to pull out from there, and we're going to search for a switch. And I'm going to drag this up. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. So we have one connecting into the previous and one connecting into the next. And we'll connect our high, med, low temp into the selection. And this is what we're going to want to do based on whether we're going to the previous or the next and what the setting is. So we're drawing in whatever setting that the value is currently at. We put it into a temporary variable here. And then we're going to readjust it based on whether we want to go to the previous setting or the next setting. So from our previous setting here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to set our high, med, low temp. And if we're going to the previous one, if we're at low already, there's no value lower than low. So we're not actually going to do anything. If we go to the medium one, we're going to go ahead and set our value to low. And then we're going to duplicate this. We're going to plug it into the high. And if we're coming from a high setting, the previous setting is going to be medium. I'm going to then duplicate these. So we have 2 for our next enum. And if we're going to the next setting, if we're at high, we don't need to do anything. If we're at medium, we're going to need to set it to high. And if we're at low, we're going to need to set it to medium. Then for our then one pin on our sequence, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab the setting type here, and I'm going to perform a switch. And I'm going to drag from our then one down to our switch. And we're going to have to end up creating some variables to hold the values for each one of these settings that we're saving. So to the left here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new variable. We're going to call it anti-aliasing. And for the type, we're going to make it our high, medium, low enum. And then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. And I'm going to call this one post-processing. I'm going to duplicate it again. We'll make one for our shadow quality. Once again, we'll duplicate it. And we will name this the texture quality. And then we'll duplicate it one last time. And we'll call this our effects quality. So we should have 5 or 1 for each setting that we're going to be changing. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to drag out and we are going to set these values. And I'm just going to simply line these guys up here. And so then we'll plug the appropriate value from our enum output into the correct value over here. So anti-aliasing will go to anti-aliasing, post-processing will go to post-processing, etc. And then we're going to go ahead and get our high, medium, low temp, and we're going to plug that into each one of these sets. And then that's going to be it. So I'm going to go ahead and compile and save, and we'll close out of our function. And then for our functions here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to call on that function we just made. So from our AA previous button, I'm going to drag out, and I'm going to search for the prev-next HML setting. And then we're going to select previous for the setting. We're going to plug in the actual value of the anti-aliasing. So I'm going to get our anti-aliasing variable, and we're going to plug that into setting, and the setting type will be anti-aliasing. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to duplicate this, and we'll plug it into our anti-aliasing next button, but we're going to set the previous next value to next. And we're going to do the same thing for each one of our buttons. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate our previous next function. And then we'll just go ahead and get the post-processing value, and we'll plug that into our setting, and we'll set the previous to the previous. We'll duplicate it again for the post-processing next button. We'll set it to next. And we have to make sure to change the setting type here to post-processing as well. And then we'll do the same for the remainder of the buttons. All right, so at this point, we're going to go ahead and we have, for our previous buttons, I've organized them all on the left, and our next buttons all on the right. So all of the previous next setting functions should have previous next set to previous for the previous buttons, and set to next for the next buttons. We have the value that we just created for that particular setting plugged into the setting itself. And then for each one, we set the setting type to the proper type for that button. So I'm just going to go ahead and put comment boxes around these. And this is just going to leave our apply button being the only one that's not going to be filled out yet. But that's going to be perfectly fine. So I'm going to compile and save. And then we need to go into the designer. And for the remainder of our text, we need to go ahead and select each one and create a binding for each one. And I set the wrong binding on that one. So we don't want to bind the color and opacity, we want to bind the actual text. And then we're just going to go ahead and we're going to grab the value. So for this one, the anti-aliasing, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get it. And we're going to have to perform a switch. And we're going to have to copy these return nodes 3 times. And we'll plug in the high, medium, low to each one. And then we'll go ahead and set the value. So for high, we'll return text high. For medium, we'll return the text medium. And then for low, we'll go ahead and return the text low. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I think I can carry this over. I guess we'll find out. So next I will do the post-processing quality. And we'll create a new binding for the text. And it does let us copy that return node. That's excellent. So all we need to do is go ahead and plug in our value here for the post-processing. And rename the function to get post text. And it didn't carry over the values in the return nodes, so we're going to have to type that out again. And we'll just do a binding for all the remaining values. Alright, so I'll go ahead and compile and save. And if we hit play, and we go into our settings, in our graphics pane here, if we hit the previous buttons on each one, they should change accordingly. And if we hit the next button, they will increment as well. And of course we can change the resolution as well. Now the apply button isn't going to necessarily do anything yet. I have a plan for that. And we're going to have to create a save game file to save our settings first. And we're also going to have to use that save file in order to populate these values. But in the meantime, we're also going to have to get the values for our sound and for our controls to work as well. So I'll exit out of here. And then I'm going to go up to our event graph and I'm going to create a new graph. And we're going to call this our sound graph. And then we're going to have to go over to our designer. And I'm going to go ahead and hide our graphics pane. And we're going to show our sound pane. And then we're going to click on the slider next to the master volume first. And I'm going to go ahead and in the events, I'm going to select the plus button for on value changed. And this should add it to our sound pane. So we're going to have to go ahead and I'm just going to promote this to a variable. And I'm going to call it master volume. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the SFX volume. We're going to click on value changed, promote it to a variable, and we'll call it SFX volume. And then finally, we'll grab the music volume, click on value changed, promote it to a variable, and we'll call that music volume. And then once again, we're going to have to create some bindings. So in our designer, we're going to go to the text for each. So I'll select the text for the master volume. We'll go ahead and hit bind, create binding. And we'll call it get master volume text. And all we're simply going to do is we're going to get our master volume and we're going to then plug it into our return node and it'll convert it to text for us. And that's going to be it. We'll grab the volume for the SFX. We'll bind that text. We'll call it get SFX volume text. Then we'll grab the value for our SFX volume and plug that into our return node. And we'll do it one last time for our music volume. And if we go ahead and compile and save, we'll hit play, go to settings, and if we go to our sound, if we drag these values, the numbers on the right are going to end up changing. But now we have a problem. It doesn't show up in a volume that's friendly to us. So we're going to have to make some modifications to our get text and setting our text. Actually, we're just going to do it to setting the text, because we just want to have our volume variables be between 0 and 100 in whole numbers. I've never seen volume sliders where you can select a half a volume. So, in order to fix this, we're going to go ahead from our value, we're going to drag out, and we're going to go ahead and search for a map range clamped. We'll plug the return value into our master volume. And then for in range here, it's going to be between a value of 0 and 1, because the volume sliders, as we just looked at when we slid the volume back and forth, the incoming range that it has available to it is between 0 and 1, and we want the actual value to be between 0 and 100. But this is probably going to leave room for variables still, so let's test it out. We'll go to settings, sound, and let's drag our slider. And it is giving us partial volumes. So, in between our return value and setting, I'm going to drag out and I'm going to search for a floor. And then we're going to go ahead and plug this in to our master volume. And what the floor does is it essentially takes a float and rounds it down to the next integer. So if we compile and save and hit play, we go to our settings, we go to sound. The sound now travels in whole numbers between 0 and 100. So all we're going to have to do is drag these out. We're going to copy this. We're going to paste a couple of these in place, and we'll just plug from our value into the input value on the map range and the output from our converter into the set. And we'll do the same thing for our music slider as well. So if we go ahead and compile and save and play, we'll go to settings. Now all three of the volume sliders should operate in whole numbers between 0 and 100. And then we're going to have to check for our control options here. We're going to have to use our mouse sensitivity, and we're not going to really do anything with the Invert Mouse quite yet other than set a variable. So we'll go ahead and we'll close this out. And I'm going to go up to our graphs. I'm going to go ahead and add a new graph. And we'll call this our controls graph. And we'll go back over to our designer. I'm going to go ahead and hide our sound pane. And we'll show our controls pane. And we're going to click on the slider for our mouse sensitivity. And I'm going to go ahead and click on the on value changed. And we're going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And I'm going to call this variable mouse sensitivity. But we're going to want to do something similar with our mouse sensitivity as well. So from our value here, I'm going to drag it out. And I'm going to go ahead and map range clamped. And the incoming range is going to be from 0 to 1. And I want our out range to be from 0.5 to 2. So our default range for the sensitivity, the default setting is going to be 1. And I want them to be able to adjust it from half that sensitivity to twice the sensitivity. Now, if we plug just this value into our mouse sensitivity here, well, in order to see it, we're going to have to go ahead and click on the text and create a binding. And we'll call it get mouse sensitivity text. And we'll just grab our mouse sensitivity value and we'll plug it into the return value. And if we compile and save and we hit play, we go to our settings and we go to our controls. It'll start out initially at 0 and slide up. So it's going from 0, there we go, it's going from 0.5 to 2, but we have a whole lot of decimal places here. So in between the values here, I don't want these 2 extra values on the end of it. So we're going to do a little bit of work in order to truncate that. Unfortunately, there's no truncate function built into Unreal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this value and I'm going to go ahead and multiply it. And I only want 1 decimal place. So I want to move the decimal to the right once. I'm going to multiply it by 10. I am then going to go ahead and perform a floor. And then I want to search for divide. And I want to divide a float by a float. And we'll plug that into our mouse sensitivity. And we're going to take the return value of our floor and plug this to the input of our divide. And we're going to redivide by 10. So we're taking our input value range. We're clamping it to 0.5 and 2, between 0.5 and 2. And then we're going to multiply it by 10, which is going to move the decimal place once to the right. We're going to round down. And then we're going to go ahead and convert it back to a float and then divide by 10 again, which will move the decimal place to the left. So if we compile and save and hit play, let's see how it works. We go to the controls here. Once we hit it, it'll set it to 0.5, and then we can drag over, and it'll work in only tenths. And then last, we're just going to need to grab the checkbox for Invert Mouse. And at the events at the bottom, there's only one event, the onCheck state change. We're going to go ahead and add that to our graph. And we're going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And I'm just going to call this Invert Mouse. And I'm going to compile and save. So now we have settings stored somewhere. So when we adjust the values in our menu, it's going to save them. But for now, it's just saving them inside of the settings menu. So as soon as you hit the back button right here, all these values are going to be flushed out. So right now it's not saving anything. In the next video, I'm going to go over saving the data from our menu so that we can carry it over again. And it's going to be a little more complex because some of the functions we need to have from our settings menu are going to need to be called by the main menu when it first loads. So we're going to have to put it in a place that can be accessed by both the settings menu and by the main menu level. So that's going to complete the video for today. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them down below or head over to the Facebook page and you can message me. And thanks for watching.